I've coached cyclists for 14 years, every level, from someone doing their first Grand Fondo all the way through to riders racing at the very top of the sport. A minimum roster of 20 athletes for 14 straight years, hundreds of riders when you count the turnover, thousands of training blocks behind me, and thousands of conversations about what's working and what isn't. Over that time, I built a system, not a program you download or follow, a system for thinking about training, for reading data, for making decisions. It's evolved over the whole 14 years, and I've changed my mind on things. I've made mistakes, I've thrown things out, I've absorbed the research, argued with it, tested it, and kept the bits that actually hold up when you put them in front of a real person on a real bike. This video is all of it. Everything I know about how to train a cyclist. I'm going to lay out the power concepts, the zone system I use, and why, how I think about building for a training year, which workouts earn their spot, and how to actually execute on event or race day. I'm going to show you what it looks like in practice with real athletes and real data. It's going to take a few hours. There's no shortcut through it, but by the end, you'll have a complete picture of how I coach and how you can take whatever is useful and apply it to yourself. This isn't a beginner's guide. If you're brand new to cycling, just go for a ride, fall in love with it, and then come back when you've got some miles in your legs and some questions about how to get better. This is built for two types of riders. The first is the time-constrained cyclist. You've got a job, you've got a family, maybe, definitely a life that doesn't revolve around cycling. You're somewhere between 5 and 10 hours a week, maybe less some weeks when things get busy. You own a power meter, you've probably followed a plan or two, you've done the reading, and you're at this point where you're thinking, I don't have more time to give, so I need to make that time that I've got actually count. You can't just add more volume. You need to know that what you're doing is the right stuff, in the right order, for the right reasons. The second is the master's rider. You're probably 40 plus, maybe even 50 plus. You might actually have more time on the bike than the first group. Maybe the kids have left home. Maybe you've structured your life around riding. So time really isn't the issue. Your issue is that your body just doesn't respond the way it used to. Recovery takes longer. Things that worked 5 years ago don't work anymore. And you're watching your numbers plateau or decline. And you're wondering whether that's just aging or whether there's something that you could be doing differently. And the answer, in most cases, is that there's a lot that you could be doing differently, but not the stuff the internet is telling you, because none of what's written for someone your age with your physiology. If you're either of these two people, this is for you. Everything in this course is built around the reality of training with limited time or a changing body, and often both. And if you're a coach, this is about how I think about the job. You might disagree with parts of it, and that's fine, but you'll know where I stand and why. I should give you some context about where all of this comes from, because it didn't start with coaching. It started with racing. I was a serious junior under 17 Australian time trial champion. I raced and represented Australia in mountain bike cross country, and I came up through a system that was geared towards the Sydney 2000 Olympics, which meant resources got thrown at us that most juniors would never see. We had coaching, sports psychology, which was still rare for youth at that level, testing, massage, equipment, travel. We were part of studies. It was a proper high-performance pipeline, and I absorbed it, and I absorbed a lot from the coaches who ran it. Some of Australia's best, which at the time meant some of the world's best. Then there was a gap. Life happened, as it does, and in my late 20s, early 30s, I came back to cycling, not as a rider this time, but with this question of whether coaching was something that I wanted to build a career around. And the first thing I did was pick up the phone with my old coach, who was by then the national coach, and I wanted to ask them to mentor me. And that's where this thing started, not from a textbook, but from a phone call to someone I trusted saying, I want to do what you do, show me how. From there, it was self-directed. I started the Semi-Pro Performance podcast, and I asked the same question every week. How do we make riders better? I talked to professional coaches, sports scientists, anyone who would give me their time, really. I read everything I could find, and I started coaching at every level. Development riders, masters athletes, time-constrained riders with 6 hours a week. I took one rider from his first pedal stroke all the way through to his first professional contract. I was his full-time coach in his first year as a pro, and then I consulted on his program in his second, and So I've never been employed directly by a team. I've always worked as an outside coach, but that outside seat has put me alongside performance teams during grand tours and world championship campaigns, managing performance load, fatigue modeling, and pacing for riders at the very top of the sport. So when I say that I've worked across every level, that includes the very top, just from the outside, never in the team car. The whole way through, I was building a network of people that I could go to for help when I hit something that I didn't understand. And here's the thing that matters about that path. I didn't come into this locked into one way of thinking. I wasn't a pro rider who just coached the way that they were coached. I was asking the question fresh for every single athlete. What does this person need to get better? And I was willing to try things to experiment, respectfully, because a coach has many athletes and many careers, but as an athlete, you only have one. But we tried things, we tested ideas, we threw out what didn't work and we kept what did. Some of what I've landed on is going to sound familiar. Some is going to challenge what you've been taught. I've got opinions on training zones that make some people uncomfortable. I think the most widely used model of periodization is built on science that doesn't hold up, and I've built my coaching around a concept that I think is the most underused idea in the sport, which we will get into. But I'm not saying that I've got all of the answers, but I've got a system. It's been pressure tested across every level of the sport, and I'm going to share the whole thing with you. That's enough preamble. Let's start with the thing that underpins everything else: power and data. What the numbers actually mean, where they're useful, and where they start lying to you. Before we get into any of this, the durability stuff, the training system, any of it, we need to talk about power and data. Because if you don't understand what your numbers actually mean, nothing else I teach you is going to make any sense. So here's the issue. Most cyclists have this weird relationship with data. Either they completely ignore it, which I've seen a professional rider use their power meter as a simple speedo, so they're just riding along by feel essentially, which is fine until you want to get faster, or they treat it like scripture. They are so dialed in on the number, and they're convinced that every watt means something, that every ride needs detailed analysis because something really important must be hiding in that really fine detail. Neither of these is useful. Data is a tool, not a religion. And the moment you start worshipping your FTP or obsessing over TSS, you've stopped using data and you've started being used by it. This module is about what actually matters, what the key numbers are, what they tell you, and just as importantly, where they stop being useful. Because that's the part that really doesn't cross over into the language communicated to athletes most of the time. Let's start with the most important concept in all of this. If you only understand one thing about power, make it this. I want to explain why I've chosen this as the starting point, because it's a deliberate choice. Most coaches and most platforms, they start with FTP, functional threshold power. It's a 20-minute test, you take 95% of that, and that's your number. And it works to a point, but FTP is a single number from a single test. Critical power, on the other hand, comes from the relationship between multiple efforts. It's built from your entire curve, not just one snapshot. I moved to CP a couple of years ago because it gives me and you more information and more reliability. And that's not a controversial opinion in science anymore. Jones and colleagues established in 2019 that CP is the gold standard for identifying what's called the maximum aerobic metabolic steady state, the boundary above which your body can no longer maintain homeostasis. Carsten and colleagues confirmed that in 2021 that the CP and FTP agree closely at group level, but they diverge substantially in individual riders. Too much agreement lost for them to be used interchangeably, but in the cycling world, FTP still runs the show because it's simpler to test. And I'd rather give you the better tool and teach you how to use it. The other reason that I use CP is because of W prime, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what it means is we can get a much bigger picture of you as a cyclist by measuring what's under critical power and then your capacity over critical power because of how these relate to each other and to specific parts of training. Let's look at this. If we made a graph with power on the left-hand side and time along the bottom, and I asked you to do a bunch of different maximal efforts, a 3-minute effort, a 4-minute effort, a 12-minute effort, a 20-minute effort, and you plotted your best power for each of those durations, what you'd get is a curve. If it was done correctly at a true max effort, You get a curve that is high on the left with short efforts, lots of power, and then dropping down as the efforts get longer. That's your power duration curve, and it's basically your fingerprint as a rider. Now, here's the important bit. That curve doesn't just keep dropping forever. At some point, it levels out and flattens, and the power where it flattens, that's your critical power, your CP. When we talk about what CP actually is, it's the highest power you can sustain in a metabolic steady state. Below that number, your oxygen uptake and lactate can stabilize. When you can reach a steady state and keep going, above it, they can't. They rise progressively until you're done. It's not the same as FTP though. They are related. FTP is an estimate from a single test, like I said before, and it's shown to be around 5% lower than critical power. Morgan showed in 2019 that the average difference between FTP and CP is only about 1% at the group level, basically indistinguishable. CP is derived from the relationship between multiple efforts. It's more robust, both in its test and scientifically, and it's worth noting that CP isn't a razor-sharp line. Poole and colleagues in 2016 described it as a practical fatigue threshold with predictable day-to-day variability. It's a zone, not a border. But the way that you get the CP through a curve, not a single test, tells you a lot more. Now, like I touched on, everything above that line, above CP, that's where it gets interesting because the work you do above is finite. Think of it like a tank, or even better, think of it like a battery. In the science world, it's called W prime. Think of it like this. You've got a battery, and when you ride above CP, you're draining it. When you ride below CP, you're recharging it. Now, that is a very simplified version, and we don't even have it nailed down exactly how much it's going to recharge. But what we can use this for is understanding the size of the battery, which is expressed in how many kilojoules you can spend above CP before you're done. That, in essence, is your W prime. Typical W prime values, if you're an endurance-focused male, it might be between 9 and 15 kilojoules. If you're more punchy, this sort of attacker style of rider, think Tom Pidcock or Matthew van der Poel, it's 15 to 18, and these aren't fixed. They respond to training. And this is why it matters practically. If you can attack a climb and your W prime is small, you've got less margin. If your W prime is big but your CP is low, you can surge but you can't sustain. And the interplay between these two defines what type of rider you are. And this also explains why you blow up if you go above CP and you drain your battery. You drain your W prime faster than you can recover from it. At some point, the battery hits zero, and when it does, you are cooked. You are totally done. And it's not a mystery, it's simply math. So here's where most people stop. They know their CP, maybe their FTP, they know their W prime, they've got zones set up, and they think they understand the data. But here's what they're missing. Everything that I just described, so CP, W prime, your power duration curve, all of that is measured when you're fresh. Fresh legs, fresh head, good night's sleep, well-fueled. These are test day numbers. And how often are you fresh when it actually matters? Meaning at the end of a ride, at the end of a race. Almost never, I'd say. You're 4 hours into a Grand Fondo, you're at the back end of a training week. You're 3 weeks into a block and your legs feel like they're full of sand. And in those moments, your numbers, the ones from the test, they don't describe what you can actually do. They describe what you could do if you weren't tired, and that's a really large gap. Your fresh numbers describe your capacity, what you can actually reach when you're fatigued. That's your access. And the difference between those two is what we're going to spend a lot of time on later on in the course, because it's the part that almost everybody ignores. For now, just hold on to this. Your data is most useful when you understand where it stops being true. Now, let's talk about what we're actually looking at, the stuff that matters day to day when you're riding your bike. Power, obviously, heart rate, RPE, rate of perceived exertion. Traditionally, it was a 6 to 20 scale. Now, generally, the RPE used is a 1 to 10 scale. And those three things together are the important ones, not one of them alone, all three, because they tell you different things. And the mismatches are where the real information lives. We'll go deeper into this in Module 9. What to look out for after the ride. There's a bunch of general questions you'd ask if you're trying to do any type of analysis. So did your power hold where you wanted it to? Did it meet the expectation or the intent of a ride? Did you stick to the power that was prescribed? What did your heart rate do relative to power? And this is where it gets interesting because power itself is what it is. Like in the gym, a kilogram is a kilogram and a pound is a pound, and that doesn't change. What changes is your response to that power. A lot of information in that response, because understanding what your heart rate is doing, how quickly it goes up, how quickly it comes down, whether it gets up and it plateaus, or whether it keeps rising across a complete interval or a complete day, if it starts nosediving after a couple of hours, there's a lot of different things that you can see. You can start to see where you fade, where fueling may impact you, where heat may impact you. And we all know heart rate isn't perfect, but it has its place in this process. What to ignore though, and why? There's a concept that I want to introduce here because it applies to a lot of metrics. When a metric becomes the goal, it's no longer effective. This goes back even to the 20-minute test for power. If you just want to be good at testing for 20 minutes, there are many ways that you can do that. But you can overestimate or underestimate your FTP by losing the original intent of the test and trying to optimize that test instead. And that's where a metric becomes useless. And competitive athletes always ask me how they can get their best number on any type of test. And I always have to pull them back and say, the intent is not to have the best number for the sake of the best number. The test is trying to be a snapshot, not just picking up one score. So knowing what to ignore and how to ignore it is really important. TSS as a daily scorecard, not useful. Fundamentally because of the flaws in the system, the inability to separate intensities within the number itself, and here's one that catches a lot of people out. Sanders and colleagues showed that in 2017 that power-based and heart rate-based zone calculations give you completely different intensity distributions for the same ride. Heart rate underestimates time spent at high intensity because heart rate lags power. So by the time heart rate catches up to a hard effort, the effort has often already shifted. So if you're using heart rate zones to track your training distribution, you're getting a very different picture than power zones would give you. Strava estimated power, don't worry about it. AI generated insights that don't know anything about you, well, don't worry about it. We could poke fun at Strava here. It's going to get better, but right now it literally means nothing. And this is a big one. Anyone telling you that a single number defines your fitness, there is no single number that I know of that clearly defines fitness. It's not CTL, it's not FTP. There is literally no number from what I've learned coaching hundreds of riders. The ones who get the most out of their data aren't the ones with the most of it. They're the ones who know which numbers to pay attention to, which to ignore, and when the numbers are lying to them and when they're not helping them in the way that they should. And all of this information should give you what you need to make decisions on. And if it's not giving you that, good or bad, then it's not working right. Data without context falls into this category. It's just background noise. Power without understanding fatigue is only half the picture, and any number measured fresh is only telling you what's possible. It's not telling you what's available at specific points along your training and racing and events that you need. As we go through this course, I'm going to keep coming back to this. Use the data. I love the data. I am totally into it, but respect it. Don't worship it, because the moment that you let a number override what your body is telling you, you've got the relationship backwards. Right, let's talk about your curve and what it actually looks like. So you understand CP and W prime. You know where the battery starts and stops. Now, I want to show you how to actually read yourself as a rider, because that power duration curve that we just talked about, it's not a line on a graph, it's a fingerprint. And if you know how to read it, it tells you exactly what type of rider you are, where your strengths sit, where your weaknesses are, and most importantly, where to spend your training time. The problem is most people never actually look at theirs. They know maybe their FTP, they know maybe their 5-second power, but they've never sat down and gone, right, what does this shape tell me? And that's what we're doing right now. The shape matters more than any single number here. Two riders can have the same FTP, but completely different curves. One might be explosive on the left-hand side with a big sprint, big 5-second power, and then drop off steadily. And the other might be flat across the top with no big kick, but they absolutely can hold their power forever. So same FTP, completely different riders, completely different training needs. So the way we can kind of think about this, if you're high, so above this line, that may be a strength of yours. Now, in this one, I would say you just need to test these numbers to see if they could be up there. There should be a connection here somewhere. They just haven't done any max efforts in the last 90 days. But then after this point, 26 seconds, they fall away really quickly. So they may be really strong at sprinting, longer sprints, but then they can't maintain this kind of anaerobic area where you want your power to be strong above a minute or so, where they're just kind of sitting on their line. Now, they may have a really clear weakness here, and so they're not necessarily going to be puncher type of rider, but then they flatten out, and basically once they get longer, both curves are matching each other, and they're really flat along here from 14 minutes all the way to 35 minutes, which says to me that is their strength. They potentially are a time trialist or a climber where they're more slow twitch dominant. The most common thing that I see in time-constrained riders is they're strong in the middle. Their threshold work from trainer sessions, basically. They're weak on the left, there's no sprint or neuromuscular work, and they're dropping off way too fast on the right. Not enough volume to build the endurance tail. And that's the signature pattern, and it tells me exactly what to prescribe. There's a framework that I use when I first look at a rider's data, 4 types. And I want to be clear, these aren't boxes. Nobody is purely one thing, but they're useful as a starting point because they change how I think about training. Now, I should say there are more complex profiling systems out there. Some coaches use 6 types, some use 8, some build entirely individual models. And I've tried most of them, and I keep coming back to these 4 because the whole point of a type is to give you a useful starting point, not perfectly describe reality. And the more types you add, the more you're pretending you know something you don't. 4 is enough to change how you think about training. Anything beyond that, you're better off just looking at the actual data. But I think with coaching supervision, you can get around a lot of these limitations. So that's why in coaching, I will use more, but 4 for anybody that just starts looking into this stuff is really useful. So let's go through the 4. Sprinter, high neuromuscular power, big Pmax, decent W prime. The curve is tall on the left and it drops away fast. These are riders who win on their kick. They're training focused. They don't need more sprint. They need to get to the sprint with something left. Puncher, strong across the 1 to 5 minute range. The curve stays higher for longer before it drops. And these are the riders who attack on short climbs, who can go hard repeatedly. And their training focus is extending that ability deeper into rides, durability of repeated efforts. Climber, high watts per kilogram. At threshold and above, the curve might not look impressive in raw watts, but relative to body weight, it's shifted up. Training focus it depends entirely on the type of climbing that you're doing. A 10-minute climb and a 40-minute climb are completely different problems. Then there is the all-rounder. No huge peak anywhere, but no big weakness either. The curve is relatively smooth, and these riders are competitive everywhere and dominant nowhere. The training focus here really then is finding the thing that gives them the edge in their specific events and sharpening it. Now, I want to be honest about this because there are limits. Because rider profiling is useful, but it can also be misleading. And here's why. Take the same rider, test them when they're fresh and rested, and you get one profile, and then test them at the end of a training block, and you will get a completely different one. A power profile is a snapshot of capacity. It doesn't tell you about access, how much of that profile that you can still reach when you're fatigued. I've seen riders whose profile looks average when they're fresh, but who barely lose anything when they're tired, and those riders win races. And I've seen riders with incredible profiles who fall apart 3 hours in. Now those riders get dropped. The real question isn't what's your profile, it's what's your profile at hour 4, and that's where durability comes in, which is coming up in module 4, raw watts versus watts per kilo. Same rider can look like a sprinter in raw power and a climber in watts per kilogram. Which one matters depends entirely on the terrain and the event. Profiles don't exist in a vacuum. The 15% rule, if your threshold power divided by your 5-minute power is less than 85%, your aerobic engine is lagging behind your top end. I call it the 15% rule because that's the maximum gap that I want to see between your threshold and your 5-minute power before the aerobic base is too weak to support serious intensity work. And I'll be straight about it. It isn't from a paper. It's a coaching heuristic that I've refined across hundreds of athletes, and it holds up. There are some rules in coaching that come from research. Others come from years of watching what works. This is definitely the second kind, and I'd rather tell you that openly than just dress it up as something that it isn't. Your curve changes over time, and the direction of that change tells you whether your training is working. Your curve shifting right, more endurance, power equals aerobic development working. If your curve is shifting at threshold intensity, then your curve is getting taller to the left, it's neuromuscular development. Seasonal curve shifts in base training, the right side of your curve should be building. During intensity blocks, it's the middle and the left should come up. If neither is moving, something is wrong with the training stimulus, or you're too fatigued to express it. Compare your curve to itself, not other people. Your genetics, your age, your training history, your time availability, all of these set boundaries. The question is whether you're moving the curve in the right direction that matters for your goals, not whether it looks like someone else's. The fatigue curve, if you could overlay your fresh curve and your curve at 4 hours, the gap between them is your durability picture. Small gap equals durable, big gap, you are losing a lot to fatigue. So that's your power duration curve, read like a coach, not a data scientist. The shape, it tells you who you are, your rider type that gives you a starting point from where to train, and the limits of it all, and the fact that it's measured, fresh, the fact that profiles change under fatigue, that's the thread that we are going to keep pulling on, because everything we've done so far is a map. It's useful, but the territory, the actual ride, the actual race, the moment where you're deep in and the numbers stop matching what they said on the test day, that's where this course is really going. So next up, why your training zones are probably wrong, and I really do mean that. Right, training zones. And this is where I'm going to annoy some people, I just know it. If you've been cycling for any length of time, you've got zones. You know what zones are, you know what you're supposed to do with them, and you may be religious about zones, if not more than power, because either you use 5 or maybe 7. They're a set percentage of your FTP. Zone 1, you think about recovery. Zone 2, you think about endurance. Zone 4, threshold. And somewhere in there, you've got a sweet spot that everyone argues about on the internet. Here's the problem. Training zones, the ones you're probably using right now, are based on fixed percentages of a single number, and the research is pretty clear that this doesn't work the way we think it does. I'm not going to quote this directly because I think it matters. Actually, I am going to quote this directly because I think it matters. Jamnik, in 2020, reviewed the evidence and concluded that prescribing exercise intensity based on fixed percentages of maximal values, whether that's VO2 max, maximal heart rate, or FTP, has little merit for producing distinct physiological responses. Little merit. That's not me being provocative. That's the science saying your zone 2 and my zone 2 set at the same percentage of FTP could be producing completely different things inside our bodies. How's that for a zinger? The fundamental issue is that two riders with the same FTP will have different lactate thresholds, different fat oxidation rates, different anaerobic capacities. Setting their zones as the same percentage of FTP ignores all of that individual variation. You're getting approximate zones at best and meaningless ones at worst. Now, the Coggan model is everywhere. It's built into Training Peaks. It's the default in most platforms, 7 zones, all derived from FTP. And it was useful when we didn't have better tools, but we do now. And I think most people are using yesterday's system because it's the one that comes preloaded. But here's the thing that really matters, and this is where it gets interesting. Underneath all the zone models, Coggins, Seilers, any of them, there are real physiological boundaries called exercise intensity domains. Moderate, heavy, severe. These are genuine thresholds where fundamentally different things happen inside your body. Below CP, your oxygen consumption and lactate can stabilize. You can reach a steady state. Above CP, they can't. They rise progressively until you're done. And that's real. That's physiology. That's not a coaching model. But here's the problem. Those boundaries move. Stevenson and colleagues showed this in 2022. They tested trained cyclists at rest, and they found their first ventilatory threshold, the boundary between the moderate and the heavy exercise, which is roughly your zone 2 ceiling, And then they had them ride for 2 hours at 90% of that threshold, and they tested again. On average, the power at that threshold dropped by around 10%. Heart rate at the same threshold rose by about 6%. And the individual variation was massive. Drops ranged from roughly 4% all the way down to 20% across the group. What that means in practice is this. If you're riding at the top of your zone 2 based on a test you did fresh on a Monday morning, by 2 hours into that ride, you might actually be in zone 3. The boundary has shifted underneath you. Your zones have literally changed during the ride, and the software you're using doesn't know this. So this is why I still use percentages though when I prescribe, because I need to give you a number before you clip in. But they're a guide, not a border. I think of zones as a neighborhood, not a postcode. The physiology is a spectrum, and it's shifting all the time. Even CP itself changes within a single ride. And the effective way to deal with that isn't to constantly recalculate your zones every hour. That would be madness. It's to adjust based on the response. Read what's happening with power, heart rate, and RPE, and respond to it in the moment. That's why triangulation matters. That's why we keep coming back to those 3 signals together. The zones get you in the right neighborhood. The response tells you whether you're actually where you need to be. For masters and time-constrained riders specifically, your FTP might be well trained because you do a lot of structured work on the trainer, but your aerobic base, the actual endurance infrastructure, might be lagging because you don't have the volume. Fixed percentage zones don't know that. They treat your 75% as endurance regardless of whether your body agrees or not. Training Peaks and most software used fixed zones for the whole ride when calculating time in zones. So your post-ride analysis might show that you spent 2 hours in zone 2 when actually you crossed into zone 3 in hour 1. The report doesn't match the physiology. So what do I use instead? So I went through a process with this. I looked at every zone model available. I've got a spreadsheet where I mapped out every single one of them against each other. Every metric. Watts per kilo, percentage of max, percentage of CP, heart rate, everything is in that spreadsheet. And I am showing you this because I want you to see what the process looks like. This is the work that sits behind every decision I make for an athlete. Every coach should have done this. Sat down, mapped the options, compared them against the physiology, and made a deliberate choice. Not just use the default because it came preloaded in the software. Ask your coach if they've done it, not to be a prick about it, but because you deserve to know whether your training is based on something or whether someone just picked the model that was already there. What became clear is that most of these models are describing the same physiology with different labels and slightly different boundaries. The arguments between them are mostly academic. For a coach working with a real person, the question isn't which model is correct, it's which model is useful. And I landed on something simpler than any of them. I use 4 functional zones. Not because the body has only 4 intensity levels, it obviously doesn't, but because for training prescription and execution, 4 is the minimum number that changes your behavior without creating false precision. So zone 1, I call recovery. I don't rule this out as being endurance light. There is some benefit for some time rolling around in this. It's still adding some stress to the aerobic system. But the reason that I keep the label as recovery is a coaching cue. I want people to push down, keep them there, down there. If your heart rate is drifting up, then you have to think about the effort, and it's not recovery, and that's where the label does the work. Zone 2 endurance, your aerobic development zone. This is where the bulk of your training lives, bounded by your actual aerobic threshold, not a percentage of FTP. Set it where your heart rate stays stable and you can hold a conversation. If either breaks, then you've left the zone. Zone 3, tempo. And I think it's important to have a clear delineation here. This is tempo work, not threshold. Tempo has its own purpose and its own feel. It's structured, it's sustained, effort below your threshold. Lumping it in with threshold blurs this general intent. Zone 4, threshold. This is everything around that threshold level, the critical power level. And here's a key choice I made though. Everything above threshold is open. It varies by duration, by the type of effort, whether that's aerobic sprinting, the so-called VO2 max intervals, whatever you want to call them. We need a better name for VO2 max intervals, I think, honestly, because it's on the athlete to find the intensity, not a percentage. And here's an example of how I would coach someone through those shorter intervals, say 3 by 6 minutes. Set 1, you want to hit the target. Sets 2 to 5, go on feel, and then set 6, finish strong and finish empty. No percentage of any zone can replace that type of effort. The coaching is the cue, not the number. I'm going to drop coaching nuggets like this through the course as we go. It's more tactics than strategy, but there's value in the detail sometimes. I want to explain why I have deliberately gone simpler when most of the industry is going more complex. There's 2 main reasons here. First, precision is only useful if it changes behavior. If I give you 7 zones and you can't reliably tell the difference between zone 3 and zone 4 or zone 6 and 7 when you're riding, those extra zones aren't helping you. They're just creating anxiety around the workout. 4 zones means that you always know where you are. You're easy, you're building, you're working, or you're flat out. And that is enough for me. Second, and this one is the one that I feel most strongly about, is each zone should be derived from its own relevant metric. That's not meant to sound complicated. In other words, not percentages from one number. Your endurance zone should come from your actual aerobic threshold. Your threshold zone should come from your actual critical power. Your VO2 max area should relate to your actual VO2 max or your actual power at that intensity, not 106 to 120% of something else. I've built a zone system where every zone is anchored to the physiology it's meant to target. It takes more work to set up than plugging in FTP and letting the software do percentages, but it means your zones are actually yours, not a statistical average that might or might not describe your body. Now, separate to this, and I might get called out for this, I still prescribe within Training Peaks with percentages. The big thing that I have to get through is that there's a lot of responsibility on the side of the athlete to make sure that they understand themselves and that they know when to adjust. I spent a lot of time on this, and I'm sure we'll get into it later. I'm not doing an inside test, any type of metabolic cut test. I don't actually have a way to find LT1 or the aerobic threshold, so I rely on the anchor from CP, and then it's up to the athlete. I make prescriptions for different levels of intensity within zone 2 based on what I'm trying to achieve, so we can move people around the zone a little bit, not just give them a huge wide range, and the sensations under that should feel different. You need data, not just a single test. A single 20-minute test gives you one number. To set zones properly, you need your critical power from multiple efforts. For heart rate zones, I don't go out to specifically set heart rate zones. I keep an eye on it if a max heart rate appears in the data, and when it does, we double down on that and then we set it from there. The research shows that heart rate at the first threshold can sit anywhere from 60% to 90% of max, depending on the individual. LAMEDA and colleagues showed that across 100 subjects in 2020. So percentage-based heart rate zones are always an approximation, but max heart rate is the most practical anchor that I've found, and it's where my approach originally comes from. Beyond that, it's on the athlete in the session to understand what happens at different intensities. If you're decoupling on a ride, heart rate is drifting up at the same power, that tells you something, and we get into that. But I'm not sending someone out to do a max heart rate test or 2-hour stability test. I look at the overall trend of what the heart is doing, not whether it's sitting neatly in some zone. Each zone has the broader point here isn't that wrong zones will mess up some underlying physiological process. These are on a spectrum. And like I said at the beginning, it doesn't necessarily matter for the physiology underneath. It's the practical stuff on top where you start feeling the pain, riding harder than you need to, giving yourself false confidence when you're feeling strong. But really, it should be the other way around. Extra fatigue because the fueling is off, because the intensity was off, because the zones were off. That's a whole chain of consequences, and they're all practical, not theoretical. Last thing on this, and it might be the most important thing I say in this entire module. Zones are a framework. They're a language for describing intensity. They're not the ride. The ride is what happens when you clip in and go. Zones help you make better decisions, about how hard to go and when, but they don't replace listening to your body, reading the signals, and making a call based on what's actually happening. I've seen riders turn themselves inside out to stay in zone 2 on a day when their body was telling them to rest. I've seen riders refuse to push because it's a zone 2 day, when everything was lighting up and they had a great session in them. The zones serve you. You don't serve the zones. That distinction between using a system and being controlled by it, that runs through everything I'm about to teach you. And it starts here. Right, now we've got the language sorted out. We've got power, your curve, your zones. Let's talk about the thing that ties it all together, the layer that almost nobody is teaching: durability. Everything we've covered so far, power, your curve, the zones, all of that is measured when you're fresh. And I keep flagging that because it matters. The numbers you see on test day, the profile you build with your best efforts, the zones you set up with your CP, all describes what you're capable at your best. But you are almost never at your best when it counts. You're 4 hours into a Grand Fondo. You're at the end of a hard training week. You're 90 minutes into a race and the attacks are starting. And in those moments, the question isn't what's your FTP? The question is, what have you got left? This is durability. And I believe it's the single most important concept in cycling that almost nobody is teaching properly. Let me give you the formal definition first, and then I'll explain what it actually means in practice. LAMEDA and colleagues in 2021 defined durability as the time of onset and magnitude of deterioration in physiological profiling characteristics during prolonged exercise. Hunter and colleagues in 2025 refined that to the resilience to deterioration of physiological variables and performance during or following prolonged exercise. Okay, in English now, how quickly your body starts to fall apart when you're tired and how much it falls apart. Every rider deteriorates under fatigue. Every single one. The question is how much and how fast. A durable rider might lose 5% of their threshold power after 4 hours. A non-durable rider might lose 20%. Same FTP on paper, completely different riders at hour 4. And this is where I want to introduce a distinction that I think is the most useful idea in this entire course: capacity versus access. Your capacity is what your body can produce when it's fresh. Your FTP, your CP, your sprint power, that's all capacity. And capacity matters because you need a big engine. But access is how much of that capacity you can still reach when you're fatigued. And access, that's durability. That's the bit that decides whether you're still in the group at hour 4, whether you can respond to the attack on the last climb, whether your Grand Fondo falls apart in the last 30 kilometers or it holds together. I choose to build my entire coaching system around this distinction because it explains the thing that frustrated me most as a coach. Riders who were fit, genuinely fit, good numbers, ticking every box, but who kept cracking when it mattered. And the answer wasn't that they needed more fitness. They needed more access to the fitness they already had. So durability isn't one thing. It's at least 4 things happening at once. And understanding which one is failing is the whole game as a coach. I've built this into a 4-component model. And I should say, I didn't invent the research behind this. The researchers invented it. What I've done is take the evidence and I've organized it into something a coach can actually use on a Wednesday afternoon when they're looking at a rider's data and trying to figure out what went wrong. Number 1, physiological durability. This is the one that most people think of. Your heart rate drifts up at the same power, your lactate clearance slows down, the metabolic cost of the same effort keeps rising. Stevenson and colleagues in 2022 showed this. The thresholds themselves shift under prolonged exercise. Your CP at hour 1 is not the CP at hour 4. Component 2, neuromuscular durability. This is about the muscles themselves. So we get force production dropping, recruitment patterns changing. Lepers and colleagues showed in 2002 an 18% decline in maximum voluntary contraction after 5 hours of cycling. So your muscles literally can't fire the same way. Practically, this is what you see when a rider's cadence starts drifting down late in a ride, or when they lose their ability to respond to surges. The pedal stroke changes, the snap goes out of their legs. Component 3, biomechanical durability. Movement patterns degrade under fatigue. Sanderson and Black showed in 2003 that changes in pedaling mechanics. Hopker and colleagues showed in 2017 There are efficiency losses. Passfield and Doust in 2000 documented how the biomechanics of sustained effort change over time. Practically, this is the thing that you can sometimes see, the rider who starts rocking, whose pedal stroke gets choppy, who looks different on a bike at hour 5 than they did on hour 1. That's not just tiredness, that's biomechanical durability failing, and component 4, perceptual cognitive durability. This is the one no one talks about. Van Cutsem and colleagues showed in 2017 that mental fatigue reduces time to exhaustion, not through any physical mechanism, but through perception. The effort feels harder, decision quality drops. Salem and colleagues showed in 2018 that cognitive load actually reduces W prime. Your anaerobic battery gets smaller when your brain is tired. Practically, this is the rider who makes bad tactical decisions late in a race, who stops eating because they forgot, who doesn't respond to an attack they could physically handle because their brain says, I can't do this. This is also where life load comes in. The stress from your job, your sleep quality, your family situation. Your body doesn't distinguish between the stress of a deadline and the stress of a threshold effort. It all lands in the same system. One more piece before we move on, because durability doesn't just happen on the bike. I use a model I called body, brain, life. 3 channels of load that all converge into the same system. Body load is the obvious one, the physical training stress. There's hours, kilojoules, intensity. Brain load is the cognitive and emotional cost of doing that work, of concentration, decision making, the attentional demands of your job, your commute, your family obligations. Your brain is not separate from the body. When it's taxed, everything else gets harder. And life load is the rest. It's sleep quality, relationship stress, work deadlines, travel. The background hum of everything that isn't cycling but still drains the same battery. And the reason this matters for durability is that your body doesn't separate these. It doesn't go, oh, that stress is from work, I'm going to put that in a different bucket. It all lands in the same system. And a rider who's sleeping badly and stressed at work will show reduced durability on the bike even if their training hasn't changed. The freshness isn't there. The access just narrows. And this is why I say coaching isn't just about writing a training plan. It's about understanding the whole picture of somebody and making decisions based on what's actually happening, not what the calendar says, not what your plan says should be happening. I want to be upfront about something. Durability is not a new idea. The research has been building for years. What I've done is take that research and build a coaching system around it. One that puts durability at the center rather than treating it as an afterthought. Everything that follows in this course, how I think about periodization, which workouts I choose, how I teach execution, the case studies at the end, all of it runs through this framework. Durability is the lens. If you understand it, everything else makes more sense. If you don't, you'll keep building a bigger engine that you can't access when you need it. Now, I want to take you inside the ride itself. What's actually happening to your body, your system, by hour, when you're on a long ride. Because if you understand the mechanisms behind what I've just described, everything that comes after this will make more sense. Module 4 introduced the idea that your fresh numbers don't describe what you can do when it matters. And that gap between capacity and access is the thing most training plans ignore. Now, I want to show you what's actually happening inside your body during a long ride, system by system, hour by hour. Because if you understand the mechanisms, the training decisions in everything that follows will make more sense. There are 6 systems that degrade during prolonged cycling. The interesting part is that for the first 30 minutes, all 6 are getting better. Your heart, your fuel system, your muscles, your brain, your efficiency, your training adaptation, all improving. At some point, each one turns. And the way they interact as they turn, the cascade, is what determines whether you fly or fail on any given day. And I'm going to walk you through a 3-hour ride here. This is the part of a long ride that most people associate with cycling. Your body is doing exactly what it was built for. Your cardiovascular system is ramping up, stroke volumes rising, blood flow to working muscles is increasing. If you've been training consistently, this is your aerobic engine warming up and settling in. heart rate finds its groove, breathing's easy, everything's efficient. So fat oxidation is climbing, your body is shifting towards burning fat as fuel source. In a trained rider, that rate will peak at around 0.5 gram to 1 gram of fat per minute. And that's your body's learning to spare glycogen and run on fat instead. Most people never ride long enough to fully develop this system. This is where it starts. Your muscles are receiving a sustained, moderate stimulus. Capillary blood flow is increasing and your body is growing new blood vessels into working muscle. More capillaries means better oxygen delivery on every future ride. Mentally, serotonin and dopamine are rising, and this is the start of the endorphin state riders talk about: clarity, calm, rhythm. The brain chemistry is working in your favor. If you stopped at 30 minutes, you'd walk away having done your body a genuine favor. No systems are failing, no decline to manage. But underneath, the first system has already started to turn. Wingo and colleagues measured cardiovascular drift during prolonged cycling in 2005. Riders working at moderate intensity in the heat, within 45 minutes, heart rate climbed from 151 to 169 beats per minute, while stroke volume dropped 16%. So they had the same intensity, the same rider, but the heart was already working harder to pump less blood per beat. Heat amplifies the effect. In temperate conditions, the drift is smaller, but the same direction of change shows up on every long ride. At 30 minutes, you can't feel this. Heart rate might be up a few beats, you wouldn't blink twice, but the process doesn't stop. This is the deceptive phase. Everything feels dialed in. Fat oxidation is approaching its peak, pedaling economy's settled. If you're an experienced rider, your body has found its groove. Something important is happening inside your muscles. PGC1 alpha, the master switch for mitochondrial development, is ramping up. Every minute you're riding in this window is signaling your muscles to build more mitochondria. More mitochondria means more capacity to produce energy aerobically. This is the engine building phase of the ride. You can't shortcut it. You can't get it from intervals alone. It takes sustained time at moderate intensity. But three things are also happening that you can't feel. First, your slow twitch muscle fibers, the endurance ones doing most of the work, are emptying their glycogen stores, not evenly, selectively. Golick and Sultan showed this in 1974 with muscle biopsies. Ouch. Glycogen depletes fiber by fiber. Slow twitch first. When those fibers run low, your body starts recruiting fast twitch fibers to pick up the slack. Fast twitch fibers burn glycogen faster, so depletion accelerates exactly when you can least afford it. So at 90 minutes, you're still fueling fine. You've got gels in your pocket, but that fiber recruitment change has already started, and no amount of fueling changes which fibers are working. Second, your neuromuscular system is already declining. Lepers and colleagues measured maximal voluntary contraction during a 5-hour ride at moderate endurance pace, and by the 1-hour mark, force production had already started to drop. Small, single-digit %, but measurable. By 90 minutes, you're past that. You can't feel that early drop in force. Your legs don't feel weak. Your power hasn't changed, but the signal from your brain to your muscles is already getting weaker. The fibers aren't firing as crisply, and you have no idea it's happening. Third, cardiovascular drift has been compounding the entire time. The heart rate that climbed a few beats at 30 minutes has kept climbing. Stroke volume has kept falling. Your heart is working progressively harder to deliver the same oxygen to the same muscles at the same power. The hotter you get, the worse it gets. Heat makes neuromuscular fatigue worse. It accelerates glycogen use and it increases perceived effort. At 90 minutes, 3 systems are still positive, 3 have turned, and you feel fine. And that is the gap. This is where the transformation stops being one-sided. The positive adaptations are still there. Fat oxidation is running, the mitochondrial signaling is building, and here's the irony: as your glycogen drops and energy stress increases, a sensor called AMPK ramps up. AMPK is one of the strongest triggers for long-term endurance adaptation. It tells your body to build more mitochondria, improve fat oxidation, get more efficient. The discomfort that you're starting to feel is the training signal. But the negative side of this is starting to win. Your power ceiling has quietly dropped. Stevenson and colleagues published this in 2022. After 2 hours of riding at a solid zone 2 effort, the power output at the moderate to hard boundary fell about 10%. Same riders, same day. The power you are holding comfortably at hour 1 is now closer to a limit that has moved down toward you. You haven't changed anything, but your ceiling's dropped. The same watts now cost more. So more glycogen, more heat, more fatigue. You're working harder relative to your new limit without knowing it. And the brain chemistry is shifting. A 2022 review on central fatigue pulled together the neuroscience. So dopamine, the drive, the motivation, the reward signal rises early in exercise. That's the part of why you feel great in the first stretch. As the ride wears on, dopamine actually drifts back toward baseline, meaning serotonin keeps climbing, that widening gap between the two. High serotonin and then low dopamine is the central fatigue signal that inflates perceived effort. I see this constantly in coaching. A rider reports an 8 or 9 out of 10 effort, genuinely convinced they're near their limit, and then when their power file says that they were 20 watts below threshold, that's not a motivation problem at that point. That's a neurochemical mismatch. And the brain is telling you to back off, not because the legs can't do it, but because the chemistry has changed in your brain. The only thing that is still fully positive is the long-term training adaptation, the mitochondria, the capillaries, the endurance engine being built. Everything else is stacking, and it's not just stacking, it's interacting. Lower glycogen empties the slow fibers. Fast fibers take over but burn fuel faster. Cardiac drift reduces oxygen delivery. Brain chemistry shifts, inflating effort. The power ceiling drops, meaning you're working harder relative to your limit, which burns more glycogen, which accelerates the whole cycle. So there is no single study that's showing you this full cascade. You have to connect them all, which is exactly what I've done here. Everything is compounding now. Fraudson and colleagues measured this in Leapers measured progressive losses in maximal force production across the 5-hour protocol, building from those small early drops toward the 18% deficit they recorded by hour 5. By 3 hours in, you're well into that curve, not just racing, just riding. Another researcher measured it at the single muscle fiber level at 4 hours in 2013. Slow twitch fibers had lost 15% of their force, fast twitch 18%. The fibers your body recruited to replace the tired ones are themselves failing and burning fuel faster while they do it. That's why the pedal stroke feels ragged at this point. It's not laziness, it's actually measurable. If I take what the research says about each of these 6 systems and then layer them conservatively, so not worst case, just normal ride with reasonable fueling, you're probably operating at around 65 to 70% of your fresh capacity by the 3-hour mark. And most of those studies were done at moderate intensity, not threshold, not racing. If you're going harder, everything that I've just walked through happens even faster. 6 systems, all turned 65% capacity. And now the part that changes how you think about long ride. Every one of those systems failing is also building something. Glycogen depletion triggers AMPK, the signal that builds better fat oxidation. Neuromuscular decline builds durability. The stress state triggers mitochondrial biogenesis. The 6 systems failing in this ride are building the 6 systems that will be stronger on the next one. AMPK is at its strongest right now. The mitochondrial stimulus has been building for 3 hours. The adaptation cascade is at its loudest when your depleted training in this state amplifies mitochondrial gene expression compared to training with full stores. That's the mechanism behind train low, compete high. And this is why I sometimes prescribe efforts at the end of long rides, not to punish anyone, because this physiological state doesn't exist in the first hour. Your slow twitch fibers are depleted. Your fast twitch fibers are already recruited at moderate intensity. When you add hard efforts on top of that, you're training fast twitch fibers in an endurance context, which is exactly the state that they'll be in during a race. You've burned over 2,000 kilojoules to get here. That compromised state is the training tool. You can't buy it with intensity, you can only earn it with time. The cascade I've just walked through runs on every long ride you do. It doesn't care how fast you are, It runs the same way for a 4 watts per kilogram rider and a 2 watts per kilogram rider. The difference is how far it drops and whether you've built the systems to perform through it. The question isn't whether it happens, it's how much of it is manageable, and the answer is more than you think. The durability dial I'll introduce in Module 7 now has a mechanism underneath it. When I say turn the dial up, add tempo in the last 30 minutes, do a set of efforts at the end of a long ride, what I'm actually saying is get to the compromised state and train inside it, because that's where the adaptation signal is at its loudest. And that's the state your body needs to learn to perform through. How you actually structure your training to develop this, the base, the engine, the intensity, the execution, that's what the rest of this course is about. But every decision that I make from here runs through what you've just seen. The cascade is the context. Without it, the training is just a schedule. With it, it's a system. If you've ever read a coaching manual or taken a coaching course, you've probably been taught periodization. Base, build, peak, race, the classic model. Spend weeks building your aerobic foundation, then you add some intensity, and then you sharpen, then you perform. It's clean, it's logical, and it's been organizing training for decades. It's also, for most people watching this, not how training actually works. And here's why. That model is built on a theory from 1930s called the General Adaptation Syndrome, GAS. It was developed by a guy called Hans Selye, who was studying stress in rats, not athletes, not cyclists, rats. And the idea is simple. Apply stress, the body adapts, repeat at a higher level. If you get the dose right, you get fitter. If you get it wrong, you overtrain. And on paper, it makes sense. The problem is that the science underneath it has, to put it politely, not held up. Keeley reviewed this in depth in his conclusion was blunt. The original scientific platform upon which periodization theory was founded, in his words, disintegrated. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying periodization is useless. It's absolutely not. Having a structure, having phases, having progression, all of that matters somewhere. What I'm saying is that the idea that there's one correct way to sequence training, one model that predicts how your body will respond, one textbook answer that works for everybody, that's the part that doesn't hold up. I've had this argument with other coaches plenty of times, so let me lay out exactly what I think and why. GAS assumes a predictable stress hormone response curve. You apply training stress, you recover, you adapt, you come back stronger. And if that were reliable, coaching would be easy. You just calculate the dose, apply it, wait, watch the numbers, go up every single time. But that's not what happens. Not with real people, not in real life. The response to training is individual, wildly individual. Tucker and Collins illustrated this in 2012 in the British Journal of Sports Science. They sketched out 6 hypothetical athletes, each with a different genetic ceiling, and they showed that the same training input lands very differently depending on what an individual's body can absorb. For 2 of those 6, training alone never produces an elite outcome because the genetic potential isn't there. For the others, the same program produces wildly different realized performance levels. I extend that framework to include recovery capacity and life load, but the point is the same. Same input, different outputs. And it's not just genetics, it's life. It's the body-brain-life model that I talked about in the last module. A rider who's sleeping 8 hours and has low stress will respond to the same training block completely differently than a rider who's sleeping 6 hours and managing a difficult project at work. The training plan can be identical, the adaptation will not be. So I made a deliberate choice early on in coaching. I stopped writing plans that assume a predictable response, and I started building systems that respond to what's actually happening. Instead of follow this plan for 8 weeks, I think in terms of signal and response. The training provides the signal and the body responds, or it doesn't. And the next decision comes from reading that response, not from looking at the calendar. What this looks like in practice, you start a block with an intent. You want to build aerobic capacity, develop threshold power, whatever that goal is, you then apply the training and you watch it. Is your heart rate responding? Is the power shifting? Is RPE matching? Are the durability markers improving? If yes, you keep going. If not, something needs to change. So when do you stop a block? Well, it's not because it's been 6 weeks, because the signal says you've got what you came for, or because the signal says you're digging a hole. Both are valid reasons to change direction. The boring block is the best example of this. When I prescribe a boring block, a period of focused zone 2 volume, I don't say do this for 8 weeks. I say do this until we see the adaptation we're looking for. Sometimes that's 6 weeks, sometimes it's 10. The block length is an output, not an input. So if I am not following the base build peak model, what am I doing? Well, here's the framework that I actually use. And I think of it in 2 phases that repeat: apply, observe. Apply is the training stimulus. Whatever you're trying to develop, aerobic base, threshold power, durability, sprint capacity, you apply the work consistently, with intent, with appropriate load, and then you observe. Is probably the most underrated phase, and it's bigger than people think. This is where you watch what happens, not just am I tired, but what's changing. Is my decoupling improving? Is my power at hour 3 holding better? Is my RPE at the same intensity dropping? You're reading the response to the signal. And observe isn't just a beat between blocks. It includes the easy days, the rest days, the recovery weeks, where the body actually consolidates the work. The adaptations don't happen during the apply, they happen during the observe. The length of that phase depends on the individual. Some riders need 3 days to come back, some need 10. And then you go again. Apply the next signal, observe the response. This is iterative. It's not linear. You're not marching from A to B on a predetermined path. You're kind of navigating your way through it. There's one more piece to how I think about this, and it ties the whole approach together. I think about training in 2 directions: bottom up and top down. Bottom up means you're building from the rider's physiology. You're looking at who this person actually is. So their strengths, their limiters, their recovery capacity, their durability profile. And you're building training that matches them, not a template, not what worked for someone else, training that addresses what this specific body needs right now. Top down means you're working backwards from the demands of the event. What does the race ask for? How long is it? Where are the decisive moments? What power, what duration, what fueling does it require? And you're shaping the training to match those demands. And here's the key. You start bottom up and you finish top down. Early on in a season, the boring block, the base work, the aerobic development, that's all bottom up. You are building the rider. You're not thinking about the race yet. You're thinking about the engine, the durability, the platform. Now, as you get closer to the event, you start flipping that direction. The training becomes more specific. You're simulating race demands. You're practicing the effort profile. Your fueling strategy planning, the pacing, the top down, you're not asking what does this body need, you're asking what does this race need and can this body deliver it? And the taper or peak period is pure top down. Everything is shaped by the event. The volume drops, the specificity sharpens. You're not building anymore, you're revealing what you've built. The mistake most people make is starting top down too early. They jump straight to race-specific work before the platform is there, and it works for a few weeks. The numbers do look good, the sessions do feel sharp, but it doesn't last because you're shaping something that hasn't been built yet. Bottom up first, top down finish. That's the direction of the whole year. Periodization for the real world is responsive, not prescriptive. I still plan ahead, I still think in blocks and phases, I still have a seasonal structure, but I hold it loosely. The plan is a hypothesis. The data tells me whether the hypothesis is right. Peter Leo said something that I agree with. I don't believe in any training method. And what he means isn't that methods don't matter. It's that no single method works for everybody. The method is secondary to the application, and how you respond to the training is more important than which model you followed. I'll leave you with this. Every single rider I coach is an experiment of one. I've never coached 2 people the same way because no 2 people are the same. Different genetics, different lives, different stress loads, different recovery capacities, different goals, different willingness to suffer. The textbook gives you a template. And templates are useful as a starting point, but the moment you treat the template as the answer, the moment you stop reading the signals and start following the plan, you've stopped coaching and you've started administering a plan. I'd rather be wrong and adjust than right by accident, because the adjusting is where the learning happens. And that's what the next few modules are all about, the specific tools for applying this, how to build your engine, which workouts earn their place, and how to execute on the day. All right, we've talked about what power means, how to read your numbers, why your zones might be wrong, what durability is, and why textbook periodization doesn't work the way that you've been taught. That's a lot of concepts. So now we need to actually build something. And the thing that you first build is the engine. It's always the engine, your aerobic base, the foundation that everything else sits on. I know this isn't sexy. Nobody is putting, I did 3 months of Zone 2 in their Instagram bio, but it's the single most important block of training that you'll do in any year. Because without the aerobic base, intensity doesn't stick. Without the endurance infrastructure, your durability is built on sand. Every shortcut you take here shows up later, usually at the worst possible moment in the last hour of a ride that matters. So let me walk you through how I actually build this. This is an aerobic sport. You need an aerobic base. And I'll be honest, base training has no scientific definition. The approach was popularized by Arthur Lydiard in the late 50s, early 60s for his runners, and the concept stuck because it's useful even if the label isn't precise. What is scientific is the adaptations that are underneath it. So I'm not going to spend 10 minutes telling you things that anybody who's been around a cycling for, say, a year or more already knows. Base training matters. You know that. What I want to do instead is give you 3 specific reasons why this work does what it does, because most people have never had it explained this way, and it changes how you think about every endurance ride you do. First, Zone 2 builds your fat-burning machinery, and I mean that literally. There are transport proteins, CD36 and FATP family, that physically move fatty acids into your mitochondria to be burned. In 2023, it was shown that a model containing these transporters explained around 87% of the variation in fat oxidation capacity between cycles. Zone 2 is fat max training. You're not slowly building your VO2 max. There was another study that showed that higher intensities are slightly better at that. But what you're building is the fuel system that lets you spare glycogen deep into a ride. So that's why you've still got something left at hour 4 when everyone else is fading. That's durability at the metabolic level. Secondly, Zone 2 triggers adaptation through a different pathway than intensity. And this is the part that most people miss. Low intensity work stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis through calcium signaling. High intensity work does it through ATP depletion, and they're not the same stimulus at different doses. They're complementary, but that's why you need them both eventually, and why one doesn't actually replace the other. You can't interval your way to volume and what volume gives you. The third one, you're building a bigger heart. Cardiac remodeling, stroke volume, a structural change that takes time and constant aerobic volume to develop. There is no shortcut here. So when I say build the base, that's what I mean. You're building fat oxidation capacity, mitochondrial infrastructure through a pathway that intensity can't reach, and a structurally bigger heart. That's the platform. And here's the thing that ties it all together. Zone 2 isn't producing adaptations that intensity can't. A 2025 expert consensus and the broader research are clear on this. Different intensity zones stimulate similar aerobic improvements, stroke volume, capillary density, mitochondrial function, though different signaling patterns. The advantage of Zone 2 is not that it's magic. The advantage is that you can do 5 hours of it. You can't do 5 hours of VO2 max intervals. The steady state metabolic nature of this intensity means that you can accumulate far more total aerobic work before the stress becomes non-functional. The sustainability is the advantage here. And if the platform is shaky, the intensity just creates noise on top of it. You get temporary spikes in fitness that don't last. So you build numbers that look good for a short period of time, then they disappear quickly as well. And I have seen this over and over again with athletes. Now, and this is the part that I think a lot of people get wrong. Where you ride your endurance matters. Zone 2 is not just one intensity for everybody. Well-trained cyclists have high lactate flux. They clear lactate efficiently at lower intensities, but they also accumulate metabolic strain faster at this upper end of the traditional zone 2 range. And I see this all the time. A national level rider will tell me that 75% of their FTP feels quite hard after 3 hours. That's because for them, it is the metabolic cost is higher than it looks on paper, whereas a newer rider at 70 to 75 FTP can often sustain that for hours without the same strain because their systems aren't as developed enough to generate the same metabolic load. And here's the thing that reinforces this. When well-trained endurance athletes are profiled in the lab, they spend most of their low intensity time in what we'd call zone 1 by lactate under 1.1 millimole per liter. That sounds too easy, but because their lactate clearance is so good, they can hold that lactate at heart rate that looks much higher than the textbook zone 1 would predict. So what looks like easy riding to them is physiologically doing what zone 2 does for everybody else. So I adjust endurance intensity based on where the rider is. The longer someone's been training consistently, the lower the percentage of CP that they need to ride to stay in a true zone 2 because their metabolic cost rises faster at the upper end of the traditional range. The bands I work with are roughly a beginner in their first year of structured training sits from 60 to 75 CP, developing rider, so 1 to 3 years around 58 to 72, and a trained rider, say 3 to 6 years in, is 52 to 67, and well-trained riders 6 years and beyond often end up in 50 to 65 of CP. So these are definitely just coaching estimates. I've refined them slightly over the years. I haven't lifted them from a paper. The principles underneath them are well established. Lactate clearance scales with training age. Metabolic cost are at the same relative intensity, rises with development. But the specific numbers come from watching what works. How you actually monitor this in real time? Well, the practical tools for dialing in the right intensity ride by ride, that's definitely coming in Module 9 when we get into execution. The base phase is aerobic priority, not aerobic only. There's room for variety. There's tempo efforts, neuromuscular work, there's short openers, as long as the primary intent is building the engine. And Almquist showed this in 2021 with having endurance cyclists do short sprints, and they were adding it to their low-intensity rides, and they preserved their 20-minute power output compared to those who kept a steady pace only. So you're not contaminating the base, sprinkling in some intensity, you're making it more robust. And what you're not doing is structured threshold intervals or race-specific intensity over and over and over again. So volume, how much do you need? As much as you need to make adaptations, but less than makes you too fatigued. And that really is the honest answer. And it's not always the answer people want to hear, but that's as simple as I can make it. If you've got 6 to 8 hours a week, most of that should be aerobic work with intent. If you've got 10 to 12, you can go bigger. The principle is still the same. The majority of work is building the engine. How long? This is where the signal-based thinking applies here. The base phase runs until you see the adaptation. For most riders, that's 6 to 10 weeks. The signs: resting heart rate drop, heart rate at zone 2 power drops, aerobic decoupling improves, RPE drops. When those signals appear and stabilize, the base has done its job. Within the base phase and within your regular long rides generally, there's a decision tool that I use that I call the durability dial. It's a simple idea. On any given long ride, you have a choice. Do you ride for time at a steady effort, or do you do some fatigue state work efforts in the last hour when you're already tired? And the answer depends on where you are in your training and what the signals are telling you. Early in the block, when you're building the base, the dial is turned down. Just ride, accumulate the time, let the aerobic system do its thing without adding extra stress. And then as the block progresses and the base starts to solidify, your decoupling improves, your heart rate stabilizes, your legs stop feeling dead the next day. You start turning up the dial. Maybe you add some tempo in the last 30 minutes. Maybe you do a set of short efforts at the end of a long ride. When you're already 3 hours in, you're asking the body to perform under fatigue, and that's durability training in action. And there's evidence for why the long ride itself matters. Sanini's 2025 study done on runners, but the principle holds for any endurance sport. They found that athletes who regularly ran for more than 90 minutes had roughly half the economy deterioration over a long effort compared to athletes who never trained that long, a 3.1% versus 6% rise in oxygen cost. The duration of the longest weekly session correlated strongly with durability. It explained around 45% of the variation between athletes. The long ride isn't just volume accumulation, it's a specific durability stimulus. And what you do with the dial at the end of that ride determines what kind of stimulus that is. The dial isn't a plan, it's a week-by-week decision based on where you are. And that's the point. This is the apply, observe framework from the last module. You apply to a specific situation. There are two ways to think about structuring your training year, and which one fits you depends on whether you've got a specific event that you're building towards or not. I think of them as two different options, finite and infinite. Finite is what most people picture when they think training to a plan. You've got a goal event, a date on a calendar, and everything is sort of working backwards from that date. You build, you sharpen, you peak, you perform. It has a start and an end. That's the traditional periodization cycle from the last module. Infinite is riders who aren't targeting a specific event. Masters riders, people who ride sportifs, group rides, people who just want to be fit and ride all year round and ride well all year round. You're rolling through blocks, you're doing some base work, some intensity back to base, you're reading signals, adjusting, never forcing a peak for a date that doesn't exist. The goal isn't a race result, it's sustainable progression over time. Most of the people watching this probably are closer to infinite than finite, and that's totally fine. You don't need to manufacture a fake peak to justify your training. You need a system that keeps progressing and keeps you healthy. The infinite approach gives you permission to do that properly. And that's a really big distinction. And probably 70% of the athletes that I've worked with aren't chasing a specific goal event. They're just internally, they want to do better, and that is enough. When I'm building towards a goal event, each block has a specific focus, a key metric that I'm tracking and testing, a protocol. The structure typically looks like this. So there's preparation, which can be up to 4 weeks, so you're training to train, and this is optional and it gets cut off pretty easily, but when you have the time, it's about getting ready to train properly, consistency, addressing individual needs, establishing baselines. What this block looks like depends on the athlete. There's no single key metric here because everyone needs something different to prepare. Then it's base 1 for 4 weeks, extensive aerobic, key metric here, time in zone. This is the engine building that we've been talking about in this module. Just accumulate quality at aerobic time. Base 2, 4 weeks, intensive aerobic, key metric power at LT1, your aerobic threshold. You're lifting the floor, you're pushing the aerobic engine higher, so more tempo work, more structured aerobic efforts. And this can include a higher aerobic zone. Base 3, 4 weeks, aerobic event-specific key metric power at CP. Now, the training starts reflecting the demands of the event while still building the aerobic platform. And then there's build 1 and 2, 8 weeks. They are limiter focused. The key metric is increased power, and this is where it gets really individual. Whatever the rider's specific limiter is, whether it's VO2 max, sustained power, or it could even be like repeatability, that's what these blocks target. 2 blocks because limiters take time to shift, and then there's peak, 2 weeks, individual specific race, simulation, coalescence, and stacking these elements together. You're not really building the engine anymore, you're sharpening. And then there's perform, hit the goal, do well, win, or what's a win for you? So that's roughly 22 to 24 weeks built backwards from every event. Every transition point is a signal, and the annual plan sets direction. It doesn't change week to week. Weekly plans execute within it. In rolling blocks, you cycle through, so base, build, base, build. You don't force an endpoint. You could do base 1, 2, then build 1. Then you go back to base, or base 2, base 3, build 2, and then you back around. You're touching different things. You have a goal, but you're not neglecting other areas. You usually get back to something just in time after you haven't worked on it for a while. There's no forced peaks though, so you don't taper for anything. If an event pops up mid-block, you can race off your current fitness. Sometimes that's base 3 style work for a Grand Fondo. Generally, that is enough. The signal-driven transitions here, you move between blocks when the signals say you've absorbed what you came for, not because your training plan has you moving through. Sustainability is the main goal. The infinite approach works better with athletes who have more time. Usually that is older athletes, not always, but riders managing injuries or life constraints, anyone who values control and consistency over peak performance on any one single day. If you only have 5 or 6 hours a week, it really comes down, it's still the same principles, both models, shorter blocks, maybe 3 weeks instead of 4. So 2 work weeks and 1 rest week, tighter intensity phases, more emphasis on making every session count. You can't afford junk volume. Every ride needs an intent and it needs built-in flexibility. If you get sick in week 6, the block extends. If you adapt faster than expected, you move on quicker. The training plan is the guide, not the contract. So missing a week isn't a crisis. Detraining research shows you don't lose meaningful fitness in 5 to 7 days. What you lose is the momentum of the block. So when you come back, you don't restart, you recheck the signals, and then you get an idea of where you are, and you pick up where you left off. Illness resets the block. If you're sick for more than a couple of days, you've lost training stress and potentially accumulated non-training stress on top of that. So the base phase might need to extend. The intensity block might need to restart. Read the signals, not the plan. Sometimes you just will push through anyway, and this is a big one. Sometimes when things are really going badly, not just illness but life, I'll push an athlete through to the next block even if the signals aren't 100%, because your body's only going to handle so much. You don't want to drag out the bottom-up base phase for 6 months. It's worth shifting things even for a little while and then coming back to them later. Now, this is a big one. Travel is an opportunity, not a disaster. Hotel gym, running, bodyweight work, rest, all of these are valid responses to travel. The worst response is trying to replicate your normal training in a disrupted environment and doing it badly. Some of managing this is just being aware that the travel is going to happen. So you build when you have a window. A smart athlete does what they can when they can. Building the engine isn't complicated. It's constant aerobic work applied with patience, adjusted based on what your body is telling you. The durability dial, the signal-based block structure, these are all ways of doing the same thing, building the platform that everything else depends on. The next question is then, once the platform is there, what do we put on top of it? Which workouts actually earn their spot in your training week? Right, you've got the engine built, the aerobic base is there, now you want to add intensity. And this is where most people go wrong, not because they pick the wrong intervals, although some actually do, but because they add intensity without a clear reason for it. They saw a workout on YouTube, their mate told them about 30-30s, they read that sweet spot is the most efficient way to train, and they just go and do it. No connection to what their body needs, no awareness of where it fits into their development, just intensity for the sake of intensity. Every workout in your plan should earn its place. It should be there for a reason, because it addresses a specific limiter, because it develops something that matters for your goals, because the signals say you're ready for it. If you can't explain why you're doing a session, probably shouldn't be doing it. So let me walk you through the workouts that I come back to, why I choose them, and just as importantly, when not to use them. I think about workouts in a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is determined by impact per hour, because that's what matters here. You want the sessions that give you the most adaptation for the time that you invest. At the top, we have long endurance rides. I know that I just said that we're adding intensity, but the long ride is still the most important session in any week. It's where durability lives. It's where the aerobic system deepens. And with the durability dial, it's also where you can layer in fatigued state work. If you can only do one long ride a week, protect it. When researchers tracked Norwegian world-class skiers from their best junior season to their best senior season, total training load went up 35% over about 8 years. The increase was almost entirely low volume work. High intensity hours didn't change at all. The way you get better over years is more base, not more intervals. Next, there is threshold intervals, sustained efforts at or near CP. These are the sessions that move the needle on your sustainable power, and there's a reason I keep coming back to longer intervals. 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 15 minutes, and up rather than short efforts. Longer intervals accumulate more time at intensity that drives adaptation. 3 by 12 minutes at CP gives you 36 minutes of threshold work. 6 by 1 minute gives you 6. Same perceived effort, completely different training stimulus. And the progression is simple. 3 by 10, 3 by 12, 2 by 15, 3 by 15, 2 by 20. You're adding total time at threshold for each step. Work to rest ratio, 2 to 1. So you do a 12-minute effort and get 6 minutes recovery, enough to reset, not enough to fully recover. And how do you know when you're ready to progress? On your final interval, don't stop the clock. Ride until the power drops off, say 5% sustained drop, and you're done. If you're consistently going well beyond the prescribed duration on that last rep, you're ready for the next step. If you're barely completing it, stay where you are. This is what I call adaptive interval training. The final rep is open-ended and it's your diagnostic. It tells you where your capacity actually is right now, not where your plan assumes it is. It's the same signal-based logic applied within the session itself. Then VO2 max work. This is where it gets interesting because there are a lot of ways to do this. There's hard start intervals, steady state, long efforts, 30-15s, and people will argue about which is best. Odin showed that in 2024 that the variable is how much time you spend at a high fraction of your VO2 max during the session. That's it. The format that gets you there depends on the rider. Short intervals, 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, let you sustain a high average power at the same perceived effort. So for some riders, they accumulate more time near the ceiling. Longer efforts, 4 by 8 minutes, work through sheer duration at high intensity. Fast start intervals, 30 seconds, hard, then settle. They spike the oxygen demand early and then they hold it there. They all work, but they're not equivalent for every rider. The one that gets your heart rate and power near their ceiling for the most total time, that's your format. And also personality plays into this as well. If you are you prefer one format over another, you're likely to perform better in it. And there are real differences beyond just preference, like the extra neuromuscular stimulus you get from repeated sprint style intervals versus steady state efforts. That doesn't mean you ignore the other formats, but knowing which one is your bread and butter matters here. Anaerobic work, efforts in the 1 to 3 minute range, well above CP. This is where you're deliberately draining W prime, building the capacity to produce and tolerate high power outputs that can't be sustained. Think repeated hard efforts with incomplete recovery. This sits between VO2 max work and sprints because it bridges the gap. It's not about building the aerobic system and it's not about pure neuromuscular power. It's about the ability to go deep repeatedly and recover enough to do it again. For riders who need to attack, bridge gaps, or survive surges, this is where that capacity lives. And after that, it's sprint and neuromuscular work. Short, maximal efforts, these have their place, especially for riders whose left side of the power curve is underdeveloped. But for most riders, sprints are dessert, not the main course. They will sharpen what's there, they don't build the engine. Why I chose this hierarchy, it's not the only valid hierarchy. Other coaches prioritize differently, and that's fine. I've arrived at this order because it reflects what I've seen work for the riders I coach. Mostly 30 to 55, mostly 6 to 12 hours a week, mostly balancing cycling and the rest of their lives. For a full-time athlete with unlimited recovery, the order might be different. The research supports longer intervals for threshold development. Lawrenson and Bouchette's framework is the backbone here, but I'm not dogmatic about it. If a rider responds better to shorter, more frequent efforts, we use those. The signal matters more than the prescription. There are 6,198 possible hit combinations when you factor in work duration, rest duration, intensity, number of repetitions, and recovery type. You don't need to try all of them. There was a meta-analysis in 2023 that found no intensity-specific effect on time trial or peak power. As long as intervals are above CP and total volume is sufficient, the specific prescription matters less than consistency. You need to find the 3 or 4 that work for your physiology, your schedule, and your personality, and just use them consistently. I match workouts to rider type, but really, what I'm matching to is limiters. A session isn't only for one kind of rider, it's prescribed because the limiter it addresses is most relevant for the rider right now. The point is specificity of development, not labeling. So just as important as what you do is what you don't do, because rider type also determines what will tire you out unnecessarily If you haven't pinned down your rider type yet, that is module 2. The quickest tell is where your power curve is strongest relative to your threshold. So sprinter guidelines, more fast twitch fiber dominance. Sprinters fatigue faster during repeated high intensity sessions and are more sensitive to overreaching from volume. The practical rules: you decrease total training volume relative to other types of work, increase recovery between intense sessions, and this is the big one: don't give them long, steady state threshold intervals. 20 minutes at sweet spot will tire a sprinter unnecessarily, so stick to shorter, sharper work and keep endurance days genuinely easy. Puncher guidelines: similar fiber profile to sprinters, but with more aerobic engine behind it. Punchers can handle, say, more threshold work than a pure sprinter, but they still don't thrive on long, grinding, steady-state efforts. Their bread and butter is repeated efforts above critical power with incomplete recovery to match attacks, bridges, surges. Okay, climber guidelines, the opposite end of the spectrum, more slow twitch dominant. They clear lactate more efficiently during sustained work, and they tolerate higher volumes. So increase total hours, shorten the gap between hard sessions. Climbers absorb the work, but watch the lactate production rate. Climbers want it low enough to sustain threshold, but so low that they can't respond to a surge when it comes. There's a fine-tuning process there. All-rounder guidelines, they sit between the two extremes, and that means that they have to experiment. What suits a climber's recovery profile might bury an all-rounder. What works for a sprinter might leave them undertrained. So you have to test work-to-rest ratios, session density, recovery duration. Find what your body responds to, because there's no shortcut there, unfortunately. Neuromuscular long sprints built for sprinters prescribed to everyone else. Long sprints, 15 to 20 seconds from near standing starts. Big gear, low cadence to start. Build to max. These develop neuromuscular system and force production a true sprinter is born with, which is exactly why I rarely prescribe this to sprinters. I use it for climbers and all-rounders who are weak on the left side of the curve. 2x20, hard finish, the all-rounder session, 20-minute in threshold efforts. The last 5 minutes are at 105 to 110 of CP. Yes, this is more demanding than a steady state sweet spot work, but that would bury a sprinter. All-rounders can absorb it, and they need it because their races are decided in the final kilometers, not in the sprint. It trains the ability to push when you're already deep. Lactate shuttling, 3 by 9 minutes. The climber session, 9-minute efforts alternating between just above CP and then below CP. And the name reflects the mechanism here, training the system to shuttle lactate from where it's produced to where it can be used as fuel under sustained load. And that's climbing, basically. Every climb has micro surges, and the rider who clears lactate fastest holds the wheel longest. 90-second repeats, the puncher session, repeated 90-second efforts at 120 to 130 CP with short recoveries. This trains W prime reconstitution, the ability to go above threshold, recover partially, and then do it again. That is attacking, and that's the move at 3Ks to go. This is the part that most training plans get wrong. They tell you what workouts to do, but not when to stop them. The same principle from apply reserve applies here. The block runs until the signal says it's done, not because the calendar says so. It works the same way with intensity blocks. You start with an intent to improve threshold power, develop VO2 max capacity, build sprint. You apply the work and then you watch. If the numbers are responding, the heart rate pattern makes sense, and the RPE isn't climbing disproportionately, you keep going. The signal says there's more adaptation to be had there. If the power stalls, if the heart rate starts creeping up at the same intensity, if the RPE for the same workout keeps climbing week on week, one of three things is happening. You've adapted and you need a new stimulus. You're accumulating training fatigue and need to absorb, or, and this is the one that most riders miss, life stress is the number, not the training. Same numbers, but the answer isn't a new block or a deload. It's stop reading the training data as the cause. Either way, the block is done. The 15% rule as an entry gate, same rule we introduced back in module 2, is your threshold power at least 85% of your 5-minute power. If you're inside that gap, your aerobic base can support the intensity. If you're outside of it, you probably need more base work first. Don't stack intensity types. If you're doing threshold work, do threshold work. Don't add VO2 max intervals on top because you're impatient. 2 intensity types in the same week compete for recovery, and neither gets the full adaptation. Strength training fits here not as a separate module. We can do on-bike strength training, big gear starts, low cadence, force work. It slots into the intensity hierarchy. It's not separate from cycling training, it's part of it. It's important to know that recovery debt accumulates invisibly. You carry more life stress than a pro. You sleep less, your autonomic recovery is slower. 2 interval sessions a week in a plan slowly becomes 1 good session, 1 mediocre session, and 5 days of gray zone moderate effort and moderate results. And because you're always a little bit fatigued, you never get the aerobic quality either. Your easy rides aren't easy enough. Everything sits in that middle. The workouts that earn their place are the ones that address your specific limiters. Applied at the right time with clear entry and exit criteria. Every session has a purpose. Every block has a signal. And the moment a workout stops earning its place is the moment it's just volume for the sake of volume and it has to go. That's the training side now. Now, let's talk about the side that most people skip entirely, execution, how to actually do all of this on the day, in the ride, when it counts. You can understand power, you can set your zones perfectly, you can have the best training plan in the world, and you can still ride badly because execution is its own skill and most people never think about it that way. They think the training makes you fast and then you just go and ride, but there's a massive gap between having the fitness and then using the fitness, and that gap is what this module closes. Well, I close this laptop. I've distilled this down to 5 rules. I'm calling them the 5 golden rules because they're the 5 things that if you do nothing else right on the bike, they will make you ride better. They're not complicated, they're not secret, but most people break at least 3 of them on every ride. Let's start with rule 1, intensity discipline. This is the one that separates good riders from everyone else. It's the simplest to understand and it's the hardest to do. The rule is, do the workout you set out to do. You're doing a zone 2 ride, stay in zone 2. You're doing a threshold session, hit threshold. When you're doing VO2 max, get to the ceiling. Don't half-ass the easy ones by pushing too hard. Don't half-ass the hard ones by holding back. The discipline applies in both directions. Most of the time, the failure is on the easy end, riders riding their easy days too hard. And I'm not going to spend most of this rule here. But the same logic applies to undercooked hard sessions. I want to show you 3 ride files. The first is an erg mode trainer ride, perfect compliance, flat power line, exactly where it should be. The second is an outdoor ride, more variable, but the average is in the right zone. The heart rate is stable, the discipline is there. The third is what most people's zone 2 ride actually looks like. They start easy, they get bored, they push a hill too hard, they chase a wheel, they sprint for a sign, and the heart rate is all over the place. That's not zone 2. Zone 2 is your engine room. It's where the aerobic adaptations happen, but those adaptations require time at the right intensity, not just time on the bike. If you're constantly popping above your aerobic threshold, you're interrupting the adaptation. You're getting the fatigue of the long ride without the benefit. The discipline is in the restraint. The boring part is the point. This doesn't mean that every ride should be easy. It means easy rides should be easy and hard rides should be hard. I know you've heard that. The middle ground, the sort of hard, is where progress goes to die. Rule 2, triangulation. Power, heart rate, and RPE. This is the execution skill I am most passionate about, and it's the one that's hardest to learn from on a screen, but I'm going to try. I call it the Holy Trinity. Power, heart rate, and RPE. 3 numbers, 3 signals, and the real information lives in the mismatches between them. Here's what I mean. If power is steady and heart rate is steady and RPE is steady, everything is in agreement. You're in a stable state, so you just carry on. But if power is steady but heart rate is climbing and RPE is climbing, your body is paying more for the same output. That's a durability signal. You're losing access. The right response is usually to back off, not to push through something like that. If power is steady and heart rate is steady but RPE is dropping, your baseline is rising. You're adapting. The same effort feels easier. That is a good day. If power is steady and heart rate is climbing but RPE is fine, that might be heat, dehydration, or cardiac drift. It's worth noting, but it doesn't mean back off immediately. context matters here. How to use this in practice? You can't triangulate if you don't know what your numbers normally look like. You need a few weeks of consistent data before the mismatches mean anything. And that's why I don't start new athletes on triangulation immediately. I let them build a baseline first. The most common mismatch I see, power high, RPE fine, but heart rate is through the roof. The rider feels great, so they just keep pushing, and then they crack hard. 30 minutes later, the heart rate was telling them something the RPE hadn't caught up with yet. So power lies last, heart rate lies second, and RPE lies first. What I mean by that, when something is going wrong, RPE is the first signal that fails to register it. You feel fine while your body is already in trouble. Heart rate catches up next. Power is the last to drop. When they disagree, trust the heart rate. The skill gets better with practice. After a few months of paying attention to the mismatches, you start to feel them before you see them. Now, that's coaching intuition built on data. Rule 3, aerobic decoupling. This one is more technical, but it's not the most objective measure of durability you can do on every ride. Aerobic decoupling is the relationship between your power and your heart rate over the course of a ride. In a perfectly steady state effort, if power stays the same, then heart rate should stay the same. But of course it doesn't. It drifts up, and the amount of drift tells you how well your aerobic system is coping. Two 2025 papers worth knowing about are LAMEDA in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. They built a multi-variable model baseline fitness alongside decoupling markers that predicted the loss of power at the moderate to heavy intensity transition with an R2 of 0.95. Decoupling on its own correlated with that durability loss for heart rate, and in the same year, Barrison and colleagues in Frontiers in AI ran machine learning on classic power to heart rate decoupling metric and classified athletes as responders or non-responders to training with 93% accuracy. The headline isn't the exact number. It's that decoupling has graduated from coaching folklore to a validated marker of how well your aerobic engine is actually holding up. You can measure it on every ride. Now let's talk practical application by starting with how to measure it. Just go out and ride the first half and then the second half of a long ride at the same power. Compare the average heart rate for each half. If the second half is more than 5% higher, your decoupling is slightly significant. Less than 3%, you're in good shape. Credit where it's due, though. These thresholds are Joe Friel's. They come from way back. They're a coaching heuristic that he developed and refined over years of athlete data, not a number derived from a controlled study, but I do find that they hold up, and I've used them on hundreds of riders, and they line up with the recent research is now confirming. What to do with it? If your decoupling is high, you have two choices. First, reduce power to protect the aerobic zone. This is what I usually recommend during base, or accept the drift and train through it. This is what I do later on in the season when you're building durability under fatigue. Track it over time, and because improving decoupling at the same power is one of the clearest signals that your training is working. It means the aerobic system is getting more efficient. Rule 4, raise the floor, not the ceiling. This is an execution rule because it changes the decision you make on every ride. Are you trying to set a new best on today's session, or are you trying to make your worst sessions a little better? The first chases the ceiling, and then the second one, it raises the floor. Most riders default to chasing the ceiling because it feels like progress. It isn't. It's noise. The 10% rule is not a research finding. The 10% rule traces back to Dr. Joan Ulliot's 1980 book, Running Free, a practical rule of tens. She developed to help beginner women runners reduce injury. Useful advice in its original context, it is not tested progression law and was never intended as one. It became gospel because it was simple, not because it was right. What actually matters is the response, not the dose. Progressive overload means gradually increasing the training signal, but the rate of increase should be determined by how your body is responding, not by an arbitrary percentage. Some weeks you can handle 20% more. Some weeks you need to stay flat. Some weeks you need to go backwards. That is what raising the floor actually means. I am less interested in your best ever workout and more interested in your worst recent workout. If your worst sessions are getting better, you're progressing. If your best sessions are getting better, but your worst are getting worse, you're just having some good days and then some bad days. And that isn't progression, that's just simply inconsistency. Why this is the durability mindset. Most riders chase the ceiling. They want bigger numbers. They want peak performances, breakthrough workouts. But durability, the thing this whole course really is about the floor. It's about what you've got on your worst day, your most tired day, your fourth hour. Raise the floor and then the ceiling usually follows. Chase the ceiling and then the floor just stays put. Rule 5, precision nutrition. Last rule, and this might be the one that makes the biggest immediate difference for most people watching. Your gut is trainable. And that's not an opinion, it's established physiology. And most cyclists are underfueling, not because they don't know that they should eat, but because their gut can't handle what they need to eat. So let's go through a 6-phase gut training protocol. In phase 1, start at 45 grams every hour on every ride over 90 minutes. This is your baseline. If this causes distress, drop lower and build up. Phase 2, move to 60 grams an hour. Practice this for 2 to 3 weeks until it's comfortable. Phase 3, push to 75 grams an hour. This is where most riders plateau because they've never trained beyond this. Phase 4, 90 grams an hour. For years, this was the gold standard for high performance. It's now the kind of lower bound for serious endurance work. Use dual carb sources, glucose and fructose, because the gut has separate transport mechanisms for each. Phase 5, 110 grams per hour. This is where current high-end endurance work sits. Months of deliberate gut training, not weeks. Phase 6, 120 grams an hour and beyond. The top end, elite riders are pushing well past this in long races, only attempt after sustained success at phase 5. Now the fueling connects to zones. Each zone has its own fueling demand. Recovery and easy endurance rides at 30 to 50 grams an hour is enough for most, though recent evidence is moving towards fueling easy rides more aggressively to maximize adaptation. For most masters riders, the bigger problem isn't underfueling easy rides, it's underfueling threshold. Tempo and threshold, 60 to 90 grams an hour. Above threshold, as much as you can handle. If your zones are set right and your fueling matches them, you've built an integrated system. Hydration, 500 to 750 milliliters per hour as a baseline, adjusted for heat and humidity. Electrolytes matter, but don't overthink it. Sodium is the main one. Why I chose to include nutrition in execution rather than a standalone nutrition module is because fueling is an execution skill, not a knowledge problem. Most riders know they should eat more. The skill is doing it. The skill is training the gut, building the habit, integrating it into the ride rather than just thinking about it as a separate thing. So that's the 5. Intensity discipline, triangulation, decoupling, progressive overload based on response, and precision nutrition. None of them are complicated. All of them do require practice though, and the rider who does all 5 consistently will outperform the rider with better genetics and better numbers who doesn't. I've seen it so many times because execution is the multiplier. All the fitness in the world doesn't matter if you can't use it properly on the day. And the best part is, unlike VO2 max or FTP, which take months to improve, execution skills can start improving today on your next ride. Right, now, let me show you what all of this looks like when it comes together. Real athletes, real data, real coaching decisions. Let's go. Everything up until this point has been concepts and frameworks. Theory, even if it's grounded in practice, but theory without proof is just opinions. So this is the module where I show you the work. Real athletes that I've coached, real data, real decisions, including the ones that weren't obvious at the time. I want you to see what this system actually looks like when it meets a real person with a real life and with real life limitations. I've picked 4 athletes. Each one teaches a different part of what we've just covered. And before we start, I want to be straight with you. These are riders where the work paid off. Not every block looks like the four I'm about to show you. Some athletes need longer to rebuild. Some weeks the signal says wait, not push, but the principles underneath are the same regardless of how fast the gains come. Case study number 1, Tom, the adaptive system in action. Tom is 52, about 3 years into cycling, when he came to me riding probably 7 to 8 hours a week, which is a lot of time for someone with a full-time job and a family. And he was fit, not unfit, but he'd been doing the same things for 3 years and the numbers had basically flatlined. In 12 weeks, his modeled FTP went from 220 to 267. That's 47 watts, a 21% jump on the same hours that he was already doing. Now, I will be honest about what that number is. A chunk of that was rebuilding what a disorganized training regime had cost him before this point. But Tom was already trained. But what hadn't been having a consistent week, and then week to week, session to session, and then intent matched to signal. And that consistency is the thing that changed. I didn't just give him magic workouts. I restructured how his hours were organized and made every session respond to what was actually happening in his body. The watts followed that, and the results followed that as well. Adaptive training is one of the things that moved things along here. Tom's intensity sessions weren't premeditated for the whole block. Each week I looked at the previous week's data, his decoupling, his RPE trends, his power to heart rate relationship, and I prescribed the next session based on what the signal said. Some weeks that was threshold work, some weeks that was VO2 max work for reasons that I've explained earlier. Some weeks the signal said just ride easy and recover. And that flexibility is what the textbook approach misses, or if you're doing it on your own. I also applied the durability dial. Tom's long ride was the anchor of his week, and in the first 4 weeks it was pure zone 2, basic boring block principles. By week 6, I started adding 20 minutes of tempo in the last hour. By week 10, he was doing structured efforts in the last 90 minutes of his long ride after 3 hours of aerobic riding. He was training durability, not just endurance. So why did it work for a 52-year-old specifically? Well, masters riders recover differently. The stress of training sits on top of the stress of aging, work, family. Tom couldn't handle the same intensity frequency as he probably could have handled 10 years earlier even. So we just needed a consistent, well-timed stimulus with adequate recovery. Case study 3, Jasper, durability proof. Jasper is in his 50s. He started cycling in 2021. His CP has progressed dramatically over those years, close to 100 watts of gain on a strong base. That's impressive on its own, but the story that I want to tell you isn't about his CP. Jasper did the Giro di San Diego, a tough, long Gran Fondo twice. 1 year it went badly. He crashed, he bonked, he limped home. In year 2, he finished significantly faster. So despite another crash, despite another bonk midway through, the fitness saved him because the durability was there. So if we talk durability numbers as a proof of concept of module 4, his year 1 power loss from the first half to the second half of the race was substantial, somewhere on the order of a third of his first half output. His heart rate drift was, well, double figures at the same kilojoule load. And the year 2, after a year of durability, focused training, both numbers had roughly halved at the same accumulated workload. Now, that's not marginal improvement. That is a fundamentally different rider under fatigue. Durability saved the day when everything else went wrong. He crashed in both years. He bonked in both years. Year 1, those setbacks destroyed his race. Year 2, he was able to absorb them and still finished significantly faster because he had access. When things went wrong, he had enough in the tank to adapt and recover. And that's what durability buys you, resilience to the unpredictable. So what we actually did in his training, progressive long rides with durability dial, fueling protocols. He was massively under fueling in year 1. Late ride efforts to teach the body to perform under fatigue, and Critically, managing the body-brain life load. Jasper has a demanding job and family life, and the training had to fit around that, not fight up against it. And the number that I want you to land on, the heart rate drift, came down dramatically at the same workload. That's not a fitness improvement on its own. His CP went up too, but this is specifically about durability. His body was paying less for the same output 4 hours in. That is the durability curve flattening. And that's exactly what we're after. Signal-based decisions, durability as the lens, zones set from physiology, not percentages, intensity that earns its place, execution skills practiced on every ride, and a training structure that responds to what's actually happening, not what a training plan predicted would happen. That's what I've built. That's 14 years of coaching distilled into a system that works, not because it's complicated, but because it pays attention. And if you've made it this far, you now have the complete picture. Every concept I use, every framework that I've built, every principle I coach by. This is the what and the why. The how, applying this to your specific situation, your data, your life, your goals, that's coaching. And that's what I do every single day. Thanks for watching. Now, go ride your bike.